All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our October Zero Waste Task Force. My name is Courtney Williams with WASS, and we are joined tonight by our guest, Michael Shank from Beyond Plastics. So to start off, I just want to welcome everybody here tonight and introduce WASS. So WASS stands for Westchester Alliance for Sustainable Solutions, and we are an alliance of community organizations from across Westchester County working to close the Wheelabrator Westchester trash incinerator in Peekskill and move Westchester County to zero waste. So this is our agenda for tonight. So we'll do a welcome and a quick background, and then I'm going to hand it over to Michael, and I will let him do most of his introduction. And then, of course, we were supposed to be joined tonight by Ann Rabe from NYPIRG, New York Public Interest Research Group, but unfortunately, she's under the weather and unable to join us. So we are just going to get to hear more from Michael. As usual, we are recording and we'll put this on our YouTube page. So if you can't stay for the whole time, that's all right. Feel free to use the chat for questions and things like that. And then after Michael's presentation, we will just be opening the floor for discussion. So there's not really many updates. We did have a good turnout last month to the Westchester County Board of Legislators meeting, where we had several WASS members speak, asking on the status of the waste reduction study RFP that they issued back in February, and we had not been able to get an update on, and we had not been getting responses to our requests for meetings with the county. And thankfully, shortly after I sent out that alert to turn people out to a meeting, I did hear from Peter McCart, and we are having a meeting later this month. So I hope for our November meeting that I will have some more information to give you on that request for proposal, which we're really hoping the county is going to use the 90,000 of our tax dollars to use to create a roadmap to get us off of trash incineration. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen. And if I can, and spotlight Michael, who I have known for many years because Michael used to live in Peekskill and serve with me on the City of Peekskill Conservation Advisory Council. And that many years ago, he was working on raising awareness about the trash incinerator. And so he has since moved on from Peekskill and doing more incredible work, but we carry on the fight here in Westchester and in Peekskill. And so with that, Michael's, worked with the United Nations, professor at NYU, worked with the Vatican, all kinds of amazing work. So when the topic of our meeting this month being Think Local, Act Global, he was kind of the first person that came to my mind because he has worked on every level and hopefully will regale us with stories of what worked and leave us motivated and ready for action. So with that, I hand it over to you, Michael.
Awesome, Courtney. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me. It's great to see you again. It's great to be with folks from my former home in Peekskill. I have indeed moved on from Peekskill. I love that town so much. And so it's great to be with people who are fighting the good fight in that town. I noticed on the WASS Peekskill, I don't know how you pronounce it, Courtney. I assume it's WASS, WASS. The link in the chat has some of my pieces still in there, some of which I wrote with Courtney. And so anything I can do to support the fight in Westchester County and Peekskill for a cleaner, safer environment, I'm all in. So when Courtney reached out, I was like, yes, happy to chat. Now, I will say a small caveat that in my new role, which Courtney teed up, and the link is also in chat with Beyond Plastics, I just joined last week. And so I am not an expert yet at all in that space. I am the managing director there, so I'm supporting an amazing team, some of whom you probably know because I was chatting with Courtney in advance of this conversation, and I know Alexis and others have been in conversation with many of you about New York State fights on the plastic front. And the link is in chat. I'll put it in chat later too. There's lots of ways to take action. Some of you are probably very involved already with Beyond Plastics. Thank you so much for your service and your efforts to help us get rid of plastic pollution in all the ways. Obviously, you are with zero waste in your efforts at WASS, so you're clearly in this work. When Courtney was exploring this idea of local to global and how it all connects, this was an interesting exploration for me. And before I get into a few slides to kind of guide our conversation, and then I'm really interested in Q&A and conversation because that's where the rich stuff comes out anyway. So I don't have many slides and they're mostly visual, not a lot of text. But I want to give one preface before I jump into some slides, and it's the following. So for the last 7 years formally, and then another 10 total working with cities, that has been my primary work prior to coming to Beyond Plastics. So I worked with several organizations. I will tell them to you now just for the purpose of telling you. You probably won't remember their names because they're long, but the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, the Southeast Sustainability Directors Network, and all of these networks are networks of many cities and counties globally. I don't think Peekskill is a member of USDN, Urban Sustainability Directors Network, but for example, New York City is a member of both the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance and the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. Why this is important is that to this conversation especially, one thing I was racking my brain about the entire time there as director of engagement, that was my job. So director of stakeholder engagement, and you can interpret stakeholder in all the ways because it was all the ways, private and public, big, small, religious, non-religious, community-based organizations, hospitals, schools, etc. Was how do we take individual work at the local level and make it bigger than just that moment where the whole is indeed greater than some of its parts. And so when I think about zero waste work, we're at an interesting moment in US history in terms of really moving the needle on both zero waste generally, food waste specifically, plastic waste specifically too, I didn't want to say secondarily. And a lot of this work has bipartisan support. So one of the reasons I was attracted to come to Beyond Plastics, I was attracted to Beyond Plastics for a bunch of reasons, but one reason is that climate policy in the United States has really become a democratic agenda. It's really become a political position, which is unfortunate. I used to do a lot of work with Republican members of Congress, Republican staff. If you look up my co-authors in the past years, I used to write with members of both Republican Party and Democratic Party, Republican members of Congress and Democratic members of Congress, because back then it was bipartisan. That's not the case in the climate space much anymore, which is unfortunate because Republicans too care about conservation and clean air and clean water. And unfortunately, climate policy, climate action has really become a single party issue. With plastics and with waste and with food, that's not quite the case in my assessment. And the polling bears that out. On the plastics front, it's still pretty bipartisan. There's an overwhelming majority that doesn't like plastics in their brain and in their heart and in their body and in their hormones and in their habitats. So when it comes to plastics, I do think in this moment of time, we have a real opportunity to lead in this space. And so the importance of leading locally and then leveraging up that power to the municipality, to the state, to the federal is going to be essential. So working with cities, I was thinking about that all the time. How can local action be leveraged either regionally or nationally or internationally so that we're surround sounding, for example, the climate talks with all this incredible subnational action, it's called, or city action in the climate space. And you've seen, for those of you in the climate space, more specifically, you've seen cities really take a prominent role in climate action, climate policy, which is amazing. It's phenomenal. And it's because national governments weren't leading, and to a lesser extent, state and regional governments weren't leading. Now in the US, thankfully, at least half the states are really leading in climate policy now, which is great. But for the last 10 years of my work with cities really took their local leadership to the national level, to the international level, to say, hey, we're powerful in this network of other cities globally, which is why when I was working with the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, which was global, the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, which was North American, and the Southeast Sustainability Directors Network, which is getting hit by hurricane after hurricane after hurricane right now and for the past several weeks. They were leveraging local power, local action, local leadership for regional benefit, national benefit, international benefit. And so that's where my head went naturally when Courtney was like, hey, let's connect some dots on local to global and how important it is and the bridge we can build there. So that's just my quick preface before I jump into a few slides, if that's okay. Any questions on that, or should I just jump in? I think I'll just jump in. If you have questions, I hope you'll go off mute, ask the question, or throw it in chat. I'll be bringing some slides up, so I may not be monitoring chat, but I assume
I can monitor for you, Michael, and let you know.
Great, thanks. All right, let's share the screen. All right, so the local to global, let's jump in. So beyond plastics, the link I put in chat, but you can also see it at the top here. We're thinking about this all the time in terms of thinking globally, acting locally, which is what we're here to talk about and the importance of it. So for those of you who haven't been to the Beyond Plastics site, again, link is in chat to the ACT. That's our first button on there to the left in our menu bar because it's so important to us. Lots of ways to get involved. And I know many of you are already engaged. So I'm not going to do deep dives on the ways you can engage in this work with Beyond Plastics because probably you're already doing it. And I had a good chat with Alexis, my colleague at Beyond Plastics, who does a lot of the New York State work. And she knows, you know, everyone raves about Courtney, by the way, and they all know the great work you're doing. So I'm guessing a lot of you are doing good work already aligned with our efforts in New York State. And as I mentioned before, I just joined Beyond Plastics, so I don't want to misspeak on any of these activities since this is just my second week. But as you can tell, in terms of local to global, harnessing all this amazing movement across the US, and that's one of my new tasks at Beyond Plastics. One of my new jobs is to think about what's the next phase of these local groups and affiliates. We have over 150 now who have signed up to partner with us at Beyond Plastics in this effort. And ultimately, we have a goal of legislation at the state level and ultimately at the federal level. So we're not there yet in terms of state legislation winning across all these states. Obviously, those of you in New York know how hard it is, and we almost had a win last year in New York State. But when you think about leveraging local momentum, local interest, local activity for the benefit of national policy or even international policy, because we have a global plastics treaty, as some of you may know, being hashed over right now in this fall in Busan, South Korea, that will continue. But just take the US, for example, in terms of collective influence, collective power. How do we take all this amazing movement and momentum across the US that you see here with our local groups and affiliates and leverage that for something even more powerful at the federal level in terms of plastics policy? So that's something I'm going to be tasked with, along with my incredible colleagues who've been doing this work at Beyond Plastics. How do we make the most of, how can the whole be greater than the sum here in terms of collective influence and seeing the policy we want to see? Other ways to take action, again, beyondplastics.org/ACT, ACT, you will see so many ways. And I'm guessing many of you have either pursued some of these, rolled out some of these, explored some of these, but there are plenty of ways to get involved. And I strongly encourage you to check this out if you've not already. But again, I'm new, so I'm not going to do deep dives on these, but I am going to talk a little bit about something slightly different, but it's really zeroing in on collective influence and what we can do above and beyond what we're already doing. I am a big believer in both and when it comes to change. In the climate space and in the plastic space, there's an active conversation about, is this corporate responsibility or individual responsibility? And I understand why many in the climate space and in the plastic space have rightly pointed fingers at corporates. You know, industry is responsible for this. They need to handle cleanup. They need to reduce. In this case, plastic packaging, for example, a New York State reference there. I'm in the category of both and, which is we need both. And so rather than dismissing one, let's emphasize both, the importance of both. No one needs to feel guilty or shamed, so much so that they're feeling paralyzed in their ability to do anything, because it's overwhelming. The climate crisis is overwhelming. The plastics crisis is overwhelming. The waste crisis is indeed overwhelming. And no one should be made to feel so guilty or burdened by that responsibility that they need to do it all of themselves, or it was their fault. That's not helpful. And that's why I think people rightly pointed fingers at industry, because industry knew, like Exxon knew, that they were causing the climate crisis and that fossil fuels were responsible. Same with the plastics crisis, and they know, of course, they've been deceiving us to think we can recycle our way out of this crisis. So corporates should be held responsible, no question. But individual change, as we know, creates the demand for systems change. So especially in changing behavior on a lot of these crises, both the climate crisis and the plastics crisis, it does require us to change our behavior, which is what you all are focused on right now. You know, zero waste. I looked at your website. A lot of your efforts are household efforts. How do we reduce our own waste? Obviously, we need the county's help, and we need the city's help, and we need industry to be more responsible. We need all that help too. But when we create this demand for a different way of doing things, it creates the markets for them and the policy for them too. So I like this because I just want to frame, this is my theory of change. Both and are important. Another thing to think about in this work, which may surprise you, and you probably didn't expect this to come up, but when we think about collective influence and galvanizing the local publics on behalf of something bigger than ourselves, policy change at the federal level, the international level, on climate, on plastics, one thing that stands in our way too, not only behavior change and systems change, but distrust, which in the US, as you know, given how partisan things are, given how acrimonious our politics are right now, distrust is also quite high. That's a barrier for organizing when people don't trust each other or aren't door knocking because they're scared of what's going to happen when they do door knock, which is a legitimate fear I want to recognize too for some communities and some people who want to door knock or canvass. So when distrust is so high, how do we organize collective influence in a way that's actually effective and empowering, and ultimately, hopefully, fingers crossed, it also builds the social trust, the social capital, the social cohesion that's been undermined over the years for a bunch of reasons. And so when I was working with cities in my previous job, when I thought about engagement, which was my job, director of engagement, I was like, well, how can we get a win-win-win here? If we're trying to build collective power, collective influence, how do we collectively move forward in this work in a way that begins to build a bridge in very distrustful environments? And that does mean for local actors and practitioners and policymakers that we need to slow down, because rebuilding trust can't be done overnight, as we know, and especially with injustices pervasive in both the climate crisis and the plastics crisis and in waste generally. We know this because I also know that you know this because you talk about your work using the language of environmental injustice, and that you are an environmental justice community, which is appropriate. And so how do we, if we're going to repair harms or rebuild trust, we can't speed through that. We do need to slow down in terms of our work so that as we're bringing people on board, we're also mindful of the past harms that have been done. How do we repair those harms? How do we build trust? Because distrust is so high. So just wanting to be mindful of that, because any collective influence we do is anything we scale from local to national or local to global can only be done at the speed of trust. And that's really important. Something I stress with our cities and something that I'll definitely bring into my work at Beyond Plastics. And so this is an article I wrote featuring, and I just want to identify one or two case studies in this article, featuring ways in which cities, which you can take any version of that. This could be a local town that does this, a local group that does this. It doesn't have to be a city. It's just that's who I was working with, and this is the work they were doing. You'll see the word Cleveland here. Cleveland, Ohio, I grew up just south of Cleveland. Cleveland, Ohio, for many years, and I was part of this process, used a community building process called, and it was an asset-oriented community building process called appreciative inquiry. And It's a method out there. You can Google it and you'll find folks affiliated with it, like my friend David Cooper, who's very responsible for Cleveland's use of it because he's based at Case Western Reserve. The idea is this, that anyone who is impacted by the climate crisis, that's what City of Cleveland was looking at. They were building out a whole sustainability plan for the city. They invited to the table every single stakeholder. So that was schools, hospitals, foundations, community-based organizations, parks, insurance companies, other private business, you name it in Cleveland, and they were there at the table. And I could show you a picture of how big the room is. The room was big and 700 people were in it. And I was one of the many facilitators. I was also one of the lead inputs, but it was very well facilitated over several days so that everyone felt like they had buy-in and could participate in the designing of the sustainability plan for the city of Cleveland. And City of Cleveland doesn't have a whole lot of resources, financial resources. So its most valuable resources are its stakeholders and shareholders and the leaders from the schools and hospitals and community-based organizations and nonprofits and parks, et cetera. All of those people coming to the table, that's their asset. And so how do we build something together with everyone at the table? And so, as I think about work in Peekskill and Westchester, and even with Beyond Plastics, and if we are talking about environmental injustice, just as an example, are we slowing down to listen to the stories, make sure our process is inclusive enough so that people feel safe in that space? Because again, distrust is high for a lot of legitimate reasons. Not that we can all repair harms in the process, but by just creating an inclusive space where everyone's at the table, feels safe at the table to talk about how they're being impacted by X, Y, or Z in the climate, plastics, or waste crises, and slowly rebuilding trust that way and creating coalitions that way will be stronger later, but it does require that slowing down. What Cleveland did year after year after year after year with this appreciative inquiry process was time consuming, no question. It wasn't necessarily financially resource intensive other than staff time to help facilitate it, but are we slowing down to find ways to bring communities together to rebuild trust? Because again, distrust is high. And I say this probably, I don't know all of your bios or where you're, I got some sense in the chat, but we're all in a certain subsect of society because we care about these issues. And so as we think about, building a bigger tent, opening up the circle, being more inclusive, and especially with communities that have been disenfranchised or marginalized or heavily impacted, disproportionately impacted by any of these crises, are we orienting ourselves appropriately so that the space is inclusive, safe, and we're building trust? The other one that I want to reference from this article, and again, I could share the links later if you'd like, and they're also on my website, is that in the United States, we're rolling out, I say we, I'm no longer there, but USDN and CNCA, Urban Sustainability Directors Network, Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance. We're rolling out resilience hubs all across the country so that people have a place to go when the power goes out, when the heat goes out, when the AC goes out, when the water goes out. Moments like Hurricane Milton or Helene, they have a place to go to survive. And these hubs are community centers, they're churches, they're libraries, and they are equipped with all the things so that when you get this influx of people who need help with their basic human needs at that point, we're also bringing them into community programming and social programming to, again, knit back together some kind of social trust, social capital, social cohesion. But it's under the premise of physical infrastructure resilience when your infrastructure, your house went down, got flooded, power went out, water's no longer clean to drink, that kind of thing. You come to this community space. But what they've done smartly is that's what brings people there. And then what keeps people there is the social programming and the social connection, social sense. So it's everything from classes and workshops and games that are happening within these resilience hubs. Then you have an opportunity to talk about the work. One thing that came up this past summer, because we had the hottest summer on record, was a conversation across all our cities in the US. How do we talk about heat and extreme heat so that we can get people the help they need? And I spent time with about 60 cities planning out their heat campaigns for the summer. And one thing I stressed was like, first and foremost, get people the help they need so they cool down. That's the most important priority. It's not actually talking about climate or connecting the climate dots in that moment. Get people the help they need. Once they get the help they need, once they've cooled down, once they're feeling safe, then and only then can we have that conversation where we're connecting the dots. So I say all this because in especially a polarized, politicized climate, we have to be creative about and intersectional about how we do the work, knitting together the socioeconomic and environmental, obviously the environmental, but the socioeconomic ties too, so that people are coming to the table for a multiplicity of reasons and staying there because it's impacting the whole of their life. And with food, with waste, with plastics, that's definitely possible. With climate, that's clearly possible too. But rather than leading solely with environmental reasoning, environmental leadership, how are we embedding this work in the whole experience of someone's life so that they're coming to the table for many reasons? I saw something in chat. I don't know if I should check that. Should I check that? I don't know if that was for me.
Sure, I can read it. It's from
Yeah.
Judy Singer. She asked about Cleveland. I am a CWRU alum, so saw they were building major new construction and no geothermal or other sustainable measures. What does your CWRU colleague know about this? I would love to be wrong.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would be happy to research that with you to see what David knows. He's at the Weatherhead School of Business there, especially if their building isn't green at all in terms of embodied carbon. So yeah, I'd be happy to research that. I don't know what David knows, but happy to take a look because you would think, especially Case Western, which I think has committed to sustainability across the board. But with any new construction, yes, not only operational carbon, but embodied carbon needs to be thought about, talked about, considered in the construction, but happy to check on that. So to be continued, if I may, on that one. And then how can you get buy-in from disinterested elected officials, from folks who are not concerned with climate, don't realize the problems they're facing? All right. Was that from you, Courtney, or from someone else that you were
It was
yeah.
from me.
Right. So this has come up a lot. I'll just take a break from the slides to address this one, because this is perhaps the biggest issue facing cities across this country right now, including traditional allies like the Seattles and the Portlands. So if I were to interview all of you and ask, what do you think Seattle, Washington, or Portland, Oregon, or San Francisco, California are doing on climate? You'd probably be like, well, they're probably leading because historically they have. And yet, many of those cities are starting to see city councils that are more conservative, that are all about police and fire, for example, and are keen to cut budgets, actually, when it comes to environmental policy or sustainability. And so our cities are having to think creatively about how do we get this stuff to stick, which is why my previous comment about intersectionality and embedding in the socioeconomic too, not just environmental, is so essential, so that people see the benefits to this work across the whole of their lived experience. And in a city that is dealing with health and housing and public safety, you have a real opportunity to actually embed the climate work in, for example, the Office of Economic Development, because we're doing a green jobs, green workforce initiative. Let's put that in Office of Economic Development versus the Sustainability Office versus the Environmental Office. If we're looking at greener buildings are healthier buildings. Let's put that in housing, for example, instead of the Environment Department, the Sustainability Department, because we're seeing even the greener cities get targeted for their budgets around sustainability and environmental policy, which kind of blows your mind that we're there as a country, but we are. And food is a perfect example, because food can sit within several different departments that don't even look environmental from the outset. You know, if you look at New York City's food policy, for example, they're looking at food in senior centers, in the schools, so education, but also the senior services. I mean, that's a health initiative with senior citizens in senior care centers, the schools, the prisons, et cetera. You can embed plant-based diets in a whole bunch of different departments, or food waste initiatives in a whole bunch of different departments, without it sitting necessarily in an environmental department or sustainability department. So in terms of disinterested elected officials, it does take some creativity to think through, how does any of this work, whether it's plastics, waste, climate more generally. How does it impact that elected official? It does, but it may not be the direct route we think. It might take some creative circumnavigating their space, knowing them well, knowing who influences them, because they may not listen to us, but they might listen to someone else, and just being creative about thinking through how to make it matter to them, because it will ultimately, if we assess their needs, their interests, which could be primarily economic, for example, and there are a whole bunch of ways to go. I know you all know this. It's a great question and one I think about a lot.
Thanks.
All right, let me pop back into a few more slides. So when I think about collective influence, again, the local to global, I was thinking today, and I just typed these out today because they seem to have some relevance in the waste space, in the ways in which you're working. So I'll just talk through these 5. And there are many ways to define collective influence. There are many ways to think about collective influence. And these were just some I was percolating on today, wanting to bring into conversation with you all and get feedback, and we can tease out, add to, whatever we want. So what I mean by setting precedent, what I see in the plastic space, in the waste space, food waste too, we are tilling new ground all the time. This is an exciting time to be focusing on policy in the US because, if we get a win in New York State, that's huge, and other states will follow. We're doing work in other states too. New Jersey, we're set to focus on as well. And so we're setting precedent all the time, which is super exciting. Sure, are we late? Are we like 10 years late or 20 years late? Of course. But that's why it was so fun to work with cities who were setting new precedent for what's possible on the policy front. And once one city or state or collective of states moves in this direction, others will follow. And so that's the incredible opportunity when it comes to collective influence at the Westchester County level. As you think about other counties setting precedent, are you setting precedent in any way, and how? How do you then share that experience with other counties and cities, either within New York State or outside of New York State, or maybe even global, because waste is such a global problem? Perhaps you're building sister city relationships. That's where I talk about sistering up with cities around the world who are similarly, particularly when it comes to environmental injustice, being disproportionately impacted by the wheelabrators of this world and the burning, the incineration, the particulates, the pollutants, et cetera. And how are we sharing those stories? But ultimately in the collective influence bit, and this goes back to my conversation about Cleveland, there is a shifting of power that's required to really leverage the full power of the group. Because in any effort, if it's too top down, it doesn't actually harness the full power. And Cleveland rightly turned some of that power over to the community to co-create its sustainability plan going forward. And this is the language a lot of our cities are using, because as they think about collective influence, and in that environment, the collective influence is the collective power of the whole municipality, which when you want to move policy, you need everyone on board to do that. And so when we're either organizing as cities or as community-based organizations, if it's too top down, or if it's not inclusive enough or all-encompassing enough, we actually miss an opportunity to leverage all of this power to get something done. And it's a scary process to let go of power, but it's essential. And then lastly, the storytelling. So if we set the precedent, we're sharing the experience, we're sistering up with other cities and counties, either across the country, the state, globe, to connect the dots so that there are many of us, not just a few of us. We're shifting the power in the process, so we're all operating together. It's not as hierarchical, and that's just my theory of change. Then, of course, then is the good fun, the good work of storytelling. So I'm gonna tick through a few fun slides in the storytelling bit, because as I looked at, and Courtney and I have been doing some of this work together over the years, when I looked at the site, I was like, oh, there's so many opportunities for storytelling in ways that can tap into the setting of the precedent, the sharing of the experience, the sistering with other cities and counties elsewhere around the world, or around the state, or around the nation. And then the storytelling fun begins. Okay, I'm not going to tick through, my friend John Marshall put this together, and I'm just going to only identify 1 or 2 of these, but they developed 8 principles of climate communication. I can share the link later, but the one I wanted to hone in on is this, and it's really about real people doing real things. And I think when it comes to waste and plastics, especially, but also climate, telling stories is going to be essential. And this may seem super simple, but when it comes to waste in my own life, plastics in my own life, waste in our community, plastics in our community, waste or plastics impacting communities disproportionately, either communities of color or communities with low income, and the disproportionate burden they face that has now become an environmental justice issue. The telling of those stories and making sure, of course, they're telling those stories and we're amplifying and helping them tell the stories is going to be essential. That's what ultimately, after doing all that other work, is the tipping point. The story is the tipping point. But of course, we have to do all that other work in advance. We've got to get the policy and the precedent set up and ready to go. We've got to get the people set up and ready to go. We've got to share and shift the power so it's ready to mobilize. But the telling of the story will often be the tipping point. And I have thought about this, and these are just examples of some of the stuff I've written about that I will share in chat after I stop sharing these slides. But this is stuff I'm thinking about all the time. And in the waste space, in the plastic space, we can do a lot more here to leverage power and collective influence. Because if you think about, if you remember that slide I showed of all the local groups and affiliates, well, in each LGA, local group and affiliate, you have dozens of people participating in that LGA. Now, we want to harness the collective influence of all those people. Yes, voting is one critical way to do it, but there are all these other ways of storytelling in their respective and concentric circles of their spheres of influence that we haven't harnessed, we haven't tapped into. And I say this as someone who does a lot of storytelling, but I know I could do more in terms of influencing the circles in which I run, the spheres and networks in which I run, and the levers I have available to me. I also write a lot and think a lot about behavioral science. And I'm not going to tick through all these, but I just want to flag one or two of these that are relevant to our conversation about collective influence and harnessing power and making sure that the whole is greater than the sum of our parts. And it's social norming down here in the bottom left corner. So if we all are telling our stories about actions we're taking in the waste space, but you could think of the equivalent in the climate space, like solar panels, heat pumps, weatherization, electrification, electric vehicles, mass transit, any of the stuff we're doing or the community's doing or the city's doing that has ripple effects in the social norming space. We know that if your neighbors have solar panels, you're more likely to get them yourself. We know that if you learn that your neighbors have a lower energy bill because maybe they weatherized or got energy efficiency appliances, et cetera, you're going to be more incentivized to do that yourself. So when we think about collective influence and mobilizing, you all are doing all this amazing work. And yet when I was just doing a little research, I think about all the stories that probably haven't been told online, could be told online as we share. And it's a little trickier post-COVID because we're more virtual than we ever were before, but that also frees up opportunity to tell stories on virtual media and venues and mechanisms and channels, et cetera. So we're interacting a little less face-to-face, which limits some of that social norming potential. But as we think about collective influence, that's a key part of it. Okay, I'm going to stop share there, and because I would love to be in conversation with you when you think about the work you've done, and I just want to pivot off of where I just ended in the slides. When you think about the work you've done, do you feel like there's an opportunity to amplify in ways that either shares with more people within Westchester County what you've done and what you're doing? Because I think with a lot of this work, whether it's waste or climate or plastics, people may not engage because one, it feels tedious or onerous, burdensome, beyond their knowledge, a sacrifice, like they're losing something. When in all of this work, ultimately, the onus is on us to talk about how life is better. So with refillables and reusables, for example, it's not impossible. It does take some creativity to think through how is life better, or when San Francisco, which is well known for its landfill diversion rate, which is 80+%, it's one of the leaders in the world. They've taken in so much food waste, composted it, and then sell the soil, which is so rich, to wineries and vineyards all across Napa Valley. What a great story that is about how life is better when you actually do something productive with food waste, for example. So the question I have for all of you, when you think about the work you've been doing within WASS and within Westchester County, as it relates to waste, either food waste, plastics waste, whatever, do you think there are opportunities to tell stories either within your community that help with social norming about how life is better on the other side of a zero waste society? And have you partnered with any other cities and counties across the state or country or globe that helps you begin to have that shared experience, leveraging that collective influence, and going above and beyond the Westchester story specifically? I'll stop there because I'm just curious where folks are at in terms of thinking through any of this.
Do other folks want to chime in on that? I mean, I can certainly answer for WASP, but I know we've got other orgs. Ellen, your hand is up. Go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, Michael. Good to see you.
Hello, good to see you.
So I would say really quickly how life is better. I mean, I think the whole mission of WASS, and I know at our work at Grassroots Environmental Education, it's all about the human health impact and how life is better when we take these steps and work together, whether it's locally, whether it's regionally, or whether it's statewide. We know that our goal is to improve environmental health, meaning that we are improving air quality, we are improving public health, we are reducing health impacts and potentially reducing asthma rates and low birth weights. Every time we actually implement change, or our governments implement change, or we get them to implement policies or enact legislation that is meaningful and accomplishes this. So the other pieces are we can see that it's cost efficient, it makes sense, it's logical, it's economy of resources, but the big goal, the top of the list, right at the top of the hierarchy, is how this is going to benefit human health and our environment. How is it going to protect our resources, the water we drink and the air we breathe? And so that to me is an easy story to tell. It's just whether people are listening. And I think that is probably one of the biggest challenges, I think, as it pertains to WASS in particular, because it is a public health crisis for Peekskill and the community. It's an environmental injustice to be operating this highly polluting, heavily polluting incinerator, and we're just enabling this throwaway mentality that it really doesn't matter, and who will really pay attention? Not just the people in the community, meaning communities surrounding Peekskill, meaning the extended communities, but also the public officials who have the ability to actually affect change, who are the decision makers.
Yeah, I just want to weigh in with 2 points quickly on the health and economic angle. So on the health angle, one of my colleagues, Jess, is in Louisiana right now in Cancer Alley, meeting with a bunch of folks. They had some press events down there. The White House was supposed to be there, and then it had to cancel at the last minute. But she's down there and meeting with Rev. Reverend Yearwood and a whole bunch of other folks, Sharon Levine, that we've worked with. And those health impacts living adjacent, predominantly community college, living adjacent to these fossil fuel facilities, petrochemical facilities, the stories are abundant in terms of health impacts. In terms of waste incineration, curious if because back when I lived in Peekskill, I wrote a piece about the Wheelabrator, and I know you all have been advocating it before I wrote that, and ever since too, and have been in the trenches on this issue for a long time. Curious if, and I know Courtney, I think you did this, and maybe Nancy and a few others, you had monitors and things like that. I'm just trying to think of the ways in which have we exploited all the ways to storytell the health impacts adjacent to Wheelabrator, but also across the country. It'd be interesting to link up in this sistering with other cities and counties, other communities that are adjacent to either the identical type of waste incineration or something close to it, as a way of storytelling. Again, thinking of collective influence. We have 5 communities, all environmental justice communities, probably. It's usually the trend. And we're all sharing stories. And then I can, pitch, not necessarily me, but maybe me, since it's somewhat related to our work, pitching a reporter or a producer or a storyteller, whoever they are, influencer. Here are 5 different cities across 5 different states, and the communities are experiencing the same thing in terms of health impacts or facing the same health impacts. And so you've got this kind of collective story, collective influence story that goes above and beyond just Peekskill. Perhaps that's been explored, but this is just something that's coming up in my mind. And then on the economic angle, I grew up in a very frugal community. I grew up Amish Mennonite, and so my mom, we reused plastic Ziploc bags forever. And just these stories of frugality, and now the modern version of that is kind of minimalism, and that's kind of hip. But as I think about countering convenience, which is where single use has an upper hand, requires not just a mindfulness of what happens to that single use plastic bottle in terms of, do you care about the world? Do you care about the environment? Do you care about not only environmental health, but your health too? Sometimes that's a hard leap for folks. When you think about convenience and cost savings, there is an opportunity, but I do think, and I have a lot of friends on social media who are thinking through, like, how do I storytell this alternative lifestyle that's available to you? And even let's scratch the word alternative, because I don't even like the term alternative fuels, but this lifestyle that's available to you that is more lasting, that is more reusable and refillable. It's not so discardable. And what are the benefits? Obviously, there are cost benefits, no question, in terms of the economic benefits, but how do we creatively, and I'm not saying it's easy, because even watching my friends on social do this, my friend Sheila in New York City is thinking about this all the time. Like, how do I storytell this better life that's possible doing things that are not so single use? And so just thinking through, have we explored all the ways to tell these benefits? And I think there's more we can do. And again, I certainly don't have all the answers, but that's why I'm excited to get into this new job at Beyond Plastics to explore it. I'll stop because I know there are more hands.
Yeah. So Judith, and then Paul, and then Neil. So Judy, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm not as on social media as much as I might be, but I'm a kind of a chit chatter around town. And one of the things that I wanted to kind of alert people in my neighborhood to is that if they compost their food scraps, when the garbage trucks come around, there won't be this terrible stench on the ground after the garbage truck passes and squishes down all the food, and all the liquid pours out of the truck onto the pavement. And when I'm walking my blocks, I smell it. So I mean, it's not a big effect, but for somebody who's not on social media, if I would manage to actually share that with people, that would be helpful.
Yeah.
I think.
That's a great challenge. Like, how do we tell that story? Because the little things like that are so essential. And what couple things come to mind as you were talking about that? Judy, is I don't know if anyone has seen Rewiring America's work, but Rewiring America, a bunch of friends work there, and it's all about the electrification of this country. And it's usually in a lot of the dollars that came from the Inflation Reduction Act. And they're thinking creatively about how do we tell a story about how life is better when you, for example, get rid of your gas stove and you choose an electric stove. Now, an induction stove is awesome, and anyone who cooks on an induction stove generally likes it, but there are other benefits. And in one of the videos, the host, the guy, he's talking to camera, and he's not like a social media influencer. He's like a regular guy, and he's kind of clearly uncomfortable talking to, but he's learning his way around a camera. He sticks his face on a stove after boiling water to show that an induction stove is safer than any other kind of gas stove or whatever equivalent would be. And just that little trick of being like, I just boiled water, and now I'm going to put my face on this stove and be like, look, didn't burn my face. And for folks who care about safety, if you have kids walking around the kitchen or just care about safety, obviously the gas fumes are deadly to your kids, but those are a little harder to see. This visceral nature, like the smell of food waste, this visceral nature is such a great story to tell.
I have a kind of a follow-up to that. I do have new induction stove. I wanted to get it anyway, but I wanted to get rid of my gas stove, and I did. But what really cinched it for me and justified the huge expense is that my hip bumped on the gas stove, bumped the control, and it turned on the gas, and the gas was coming out, and there was no flame. And it freaked me out. And people can kind of relate to that. You have a source of gas in your kitchen.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm wondering if my perennial cough is caused by that.
Yeah. Paul.
Thank you, Courtney. And thank you, Michael, for everything you're doing. On top of being part of the Coalition for WASS, I lead the City of New Rochelle Sustainability Advisory Committee, known as our Ecology and Natural Resources Advisory Committee. And I could say that, for the last, I would say 3 years, I've been kind of having a multi-pronged approach of how to be able to identify some of the best practices to support, I guess you could say, environmental sustainability, but outside of the bubble of the City of New Rochelle. For example, WASS has been an incredible asset for me to realize kind of what New Rochelle residents are contributing towards the solid waste stream, so that I could be able to support some relatively progressive policies in New Rochelle. Like we just implemented our food scrap recycling program and have started our textile recycling to try and take those items out of our solid waste streams. But I also am realizing that, when it comes to dealing with the county and this constructive ambiguity through legalese between Wheelabrator and the county's IDA, that I would say that the county, even though that from the optics of it, seeing a Democratic supermajority, is pretty conservative on, moving forward on this, or assuming that natural, I guess you could say, sense of stewardship with addressing this issue. And I do like the theme of this meeting of, thinking globally, but acting locally, because, through a process of legalese with the county IDA and Wheelabrator, they are now able to operate on an expired air permit. And from the last emissions report, this has been happening for the expired air permits. They've been able to operate on it since 2021. And from the last emissions report that I was able to see, it showed that the Wheelabrator plant emitted in 1 calendar year nearly 600 million pounds of emissions into our air, and a lot of them being, physiologically harming contaminants being placed in our air in terms of lead, mercury, nitrous oxides, things that you should not be breathing at all, and because in terms of the ailments it'll have. And right now we're in a moment where so basically the county's apathetic towards that. We're putting out 600 million pounds of emissions, CO2 and other contaminants in 1 calendar year. And now we're in a point where, for the first time in documented history, in recorded history, we have 3 major hurricanes spinning in the Atlantic Ocean in Kirk, Leslie, and Milton. And, and I feel like this this normalcy of this being okay, business as usual, is definitely going to have a devastating impact on our overall quality of life, and also the significant importance of a community like Westchester County assuming leadership on these issues. Because if a community like Westchester County cannot assume leadership on decarbonizing our state of our supply chain with the wealth of resources that are out there in terms of sustainable waste management, where if you're biodigesters or anaerobic digestion, there's a wealth of resources out there that could be implemented through prototypes. You know, the money's not an issue. You know, we're talking about a county that has a budget, you know, that's more powerful than some nations in this world, you know. But this level of apathy is, you know, it is frustrating, and it's having me realize that we do have to kind of think about how to be more proactive in terms of a political agenda, especially for next year being our county executive elections, members of the county board coming up, and also because of the status quo, the historical significance of probably county officials probably seeing environmentalists as, you know, people that are, you know, passive, like, you know, we're passive with these issues. They probably see us as a bunch of hippies and not seeing us as people that are willing to really hold our elected officials accountable through door knocking, phone banking, or all the resources that need to be done. And, you know, it's really upsetting the situation that's occurring in Peekskill, a community that's overwhelmingly people of color. You know, talk about Black and brown communities. We know for certain Wheelabrator would not be established in Hastings. We know it was not be established in Scarsdale. It would not be in Chappaqua across the street from Secretary Clinton. And, you know, and it kind of is a little bit of a microcosm of the situation that we're seeing internationally, where we have the developed nations such as the US, United Kingdom, European Union nations that are taking their plastics or disposable waste and shipping it over to the developed nations. It used to be China that used to take a majority of these plastics for recycling, but was it following the National Sword Act in China in 2018? You know, the developed nations started placing it on some of the smaller nations that have less stringent environmental policies, and also the labor is much cheaper. Right now, it would be great to kind of see if you know of any best practices for community-based organizings that we could do as Paul as I could do as Paul as an individual, and what needs to be done. Because at this moment, I think it's going to reach that point where we really have to push forward. And I've been doing my best, you know, definitely working with some environmental justice leaders here. I, you know, personally wear a couple of hats in the Democratic Party, where I'm the first New Yorker elected to the Democratic National Committee's Council on Environment and Climate Crisis, and the first Democrat to be National Environmental Caucus Chair for the Young Democrats, College Democrats of America. But I don't, you know, kind of lose myself, because I used to be a Republican, and I know how it feels to be a Republican while I was in college, talking about the environment, but having my opinions dismissed because of my political affiliation. But I know at the same time that a lot of these politicians probably don't like me. They're probably just watching me on social media, waiting for me to make a professional mistake to be able to attack my character, and I might have to do like a Phoenix Resurrection in the Green Party. You know, long story short. But I think it's upsetting what's happening right now. It really, really is upsetting, because if a community like Westchester County can't get their act together, then what hope is there in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Irvington, New Jersey, you know, Newark, New Jersey, some of the areas where they are really living in the thick of it, but do not have the wealth of economic resources to really be able to put together an equitable socioeconomic agenda.
Paul, you've said so many good things there, and I'll pull out a few that I'm thinking of as you were talking, because what Westchester County types, politicians or local business types prefer, and what of course the Wheelabrator business prefers, is that this story is kept local and it stays local, because that's their power. And I lived there long enough to see even business types or political types with whom I was friendly not want to challenge the status quo in this, because Wheelabrator paid off enough people to be quiet. I say that because a strategy I've tried over the years, when that dynamic is present, that it's local, they prefer it local, they bought off all the politicians or enough of them to keep it quiet, that system it's very difficult to challenge that unless you mobilize and create awareness among all the constituency and they rise up. Like, that's the only really dynamic available to you. Like, you create enough awareness, everyone gets pissed off, and they vote a whole new batch in. That's tough. versus some workarounds and some circumnavigating that dynamic. And so I'm just thinking through, you know, if Peekskill's name is out there in other environs, and I know this, some of this has already been pursued, but I'm just thinking about building on it. If the Peekskills of this world are partnering up and appearing in other newspapers and radio stations and media outlets, stirring up trouble elsewhere, there is some benefit that can come from that naming and shaming in other environments, including for those of you who ever travel to a climate conference like New York Climate Week, or if any of you ever happen to get to any of the climate talks, but doing it on behalf of Peekskill to leverage this story for either national or international platforms, then that's a way of kind of working around this status quo bias that local politicians want to keep in place. And I've seen, you know, these fights aren't unusual. Like you can just take any industry in any small town. Some friends of mine, for example, work in San Luis Obispo, and they tried to ban gas hookups in all new buildings. Cities are trying to do this all over this country, including Canada, and the gas industry is coming in with full force to try to shut that down because they don't want bans of new gas hookups in new buildings. But not only are they fighting locally, but they're taking that fight elsewhere as a way of shining a light on their city that business types would find inappropriate because it's not the kind of spotlighting they want to see. So I'm just thinking, and Courtney and others, we can liaise about this later if there's something to pursue here, but just in thinking about the other Wheelabrator stories, and I think someone put a link in chat too, and partnering up with them and finding creative ways to storytell that either in national press or in other regional press or in other cities' local press, even that, because that will come back home in different ways. And so are we going outside as a way of influencing this system that feels intractable for all the reasons you mentioned? So I'll just stop there because I know there are a few more questions.
So I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but I'm loving this discussion. I can stay on. Neil, I know your hand is up. I'd like to propose talking about our action items, upcoming events, and then coming back to the discussion. So if people need to go, they can go, and people want to stay, they can stay. So if you can hold tight, Neil, I will show our action items. So we're doing our Beyond Plastics action items. So we have links in the chat right now. As Michael mentioned, we are close, or we came very close to passing the Packaging Reduction and Recycling Infrastructure Act last session. And so we are returning to that for this session. There's also the bottle bill, which, you know, our deposits on returning bottles, it's still a nickel, and it's been a nickel since forever and ever. And that's not a reasonable value on a bottle, and it's not allowing people who collect and recycle to make a living that way. So there's a lot of links in the chat right now. You can click and open them in your browser. So that you have them to go back to. Very simple clicktivism. Sign the petition urging Governor Hochul to prioritize expanding this bill. Don't listen to Coca-Cola and Pepsi. Listen to the voters. And then there is a letter, and you can sign on to that letter. There's also lots of additional information if you are a member of a group and you want to share it on your group's within your group's network. All that material is there. For the bottle bill. For the Packaging Reduction and Recycling Infrastructure Act, there's also a petition for that. And if you're part of an organization, there's a memo of support to click on. So those are our action items for today. All those are in the chat. And then there's a slew of upcoming events. So our next task force meeting is going to be November 13th. It's the second Wednesday as usual, air quality in children's health. And we have Dr. Amy Brown, a pediatric pulmonologist, joining us to really dive into children's health, air pollution, and those concerns. So that should be a really good presentation. Then these are all the the various events coming up, and Ellen dropped those links in the chat. So there's the Westchester Youth Climate Summit. There's a really interesting cumulative impacts implementation webinar, which is really important for communities like Peekskill, where we have a nuclear plant, a fracked gas transmission pipeline, a sewage treatment plant, a chemical plant, a trash incinerator, all these things in one spot. So join that. There is a repair cafe coming up in Hastings. The I think it's the Briarcliff Manor Sustainability Council is doing that event with the sharing shelf about donating clothes and textiles recycling. Peekskill 100, our ally here, is doing a composting tour of sustainable materials management in Cortland. That's where the bulk of our composted food scraps go here in Westchester. So I'm signed up for that on Saturday, October 19th. Then Croton 100 has a tour of the materials recovery facility in Yonkers. That's the day before, on Friday the 18th. And then tomorrow, Senator Pete Harcum, who represents SD40 and is a strong ally of ours, he's hosting an environmental regulation roundtable discussion tomorrow at the Mount Kisco Library, 1 to 2:30, to discuss the Chevron deference, which is like how the Supreme Court is trying to gut all environmental regulations and undercut the EPA and make things really bad for all of us. So lots and lots of upcoming events. So definitely, copy those links into your browser so you can participate in those and share them with folks. And with that, I'm going to close and say thank you all for coming. Please join us in November with Dr. Amy Brown from Westchester Medical Center on air quality and children's health. Thank you all. And feel free to stay on for the continued discussion.
And just a quick addition to that calendar with the Senator Harcum event, Judith Inc., who's the founder of Beyond Plastics, will be at that as well. So for those of you who do go to that, you'll see Judith Inc., who's been in the trenches on the plastics work for many years. She'll be speaking, I believe, at that same forum with Senator.
Yes, and super knowledgeable on the EPA and regulations like that. Right. So thank you all for coming, and don't drop off if you've got more questions for Michael, but thank you all.
Neil.